these kind of classes. Thanks. To ensure that you're up to speed and up to date on forms, on guidelines, on statutes. There's been a lot of changes recently, obviously with the NAR settlement. And to talk briefly on it too is obviously you guys remember we had a whole ton of forms being updated in August. And then what happened 2 months later? They updated it again. That was kind of in my opinion, a little bit of an oops on the state's part because they removed some things. This isn't the listing side, this is the purchase contract side, but that's a huge change, right? They removed the idea of kind of having a co-op. So as it relates to the buy side, how that affects us in this content for purchase contract is, do we or don't we include a co-op when we're writing an offer? What do you guys think? Do we or don't we include it? Do we include a co-op? Don't we include a co-op? Is co-op allowed? I've heard agents call me and go, co-op is illegal. Literally, I've heard that. It entirely depends on the listing agreement that's already established, right? What one good rule of thumb is, well, first of all, you should be in good communication with the listing agent. The first thing is you should be in dialogue with them and ask them. And the onus on whether it should be on C4 in the purchase contract or on a co-op, by the way, two entirely different things, right? The differentiation should be entirely on them. So if you call the listing agent and say, is there a compensation already established by the seller? Yes. Great. Is that on C4 or is that on a co-op? Whatever they tell you is fine. That's not our responsibility to verify or police that. A good indication though is the purchase contract was updated in October. So if you were making an offer on a listing prior to October, there's probably a 50-50 chance that it might be a co-op or C4. If it's a newer listing after October, it's almost with certainty is going to be use of C4. So in some cases, and this has been happening now as well recently, is there in some cases you might write something in C4 that might be consistent with what the listing agent is telling you, right? Hey, Leigh, I heard you have that new listing on 123 Main Street. I wanted to write an offer on it. Is the seller going to compensate the buyer's agent? And she says, yes. And she says 2 pineapples, right? I might go write an offer, but I might include 3. Why would I do that? Because on my buyer rep agreement, section 10A, I might have 3 that's already set aside. So is that out of etiquette? Is that okay to do? The answer is yes, you can absolutely do that. That's part of the negotiation now. Everything is kind of in front of the principles of the transaction, the buyer and seller. Does that make sense? So a set aside of 2 pineapples might already be established in the listing agreement, but I'm seeking 3. Leigh could counter back with 2.5, or just right back down to 2 and say, yeah, we don't care about your extra pineapple. Seller has already agreed for 2. So that part is entirely negotiable. Just remember that on the listing side, the listing agreement sets the floor in which the buyer agent can be compensated. So section A8A of the listing agreement sets the floor for which the buyer's agent will be compensated. Section 10A of the buyer rep agreement sets the ceiling for which the buyer agent can be compensated. So what the buyer agent earns is somewhere in between that. Same question? Yeah, okay, what's your question, Chris? I'll repeat it. Listen. How would give me an example of how there would be a change in that? Because that should be typically established in the beginning. That's a great question. Let's talk about this for a second, right? So Crystal just asked the question pertaining to the listing side, how would you make the change? Let's say on section A8A, it says 2 pineapples on there. And then you're in the negotiation. And in the negotiation, because of the tone of the negotiation, it's suddenly you've agreed to 2.5 pineapples. So she's asking, should you amend the listing agreement? What do you guys think? Okay, we got one yes. No, everyone else has had way too much. Here's my rule of thumb on those kind of things. Imagine when you enter into a purchase contract, right? You're entering into a purchase contract when two simultaneous agreements are already established, right? One agreement is the buyer rep agreement between the brokerage and the buyer, and the other one is the exclusive right to sell between the seller and the listing agent. Those two, imagine circles, like a Venn diagram, like you have a circle here of one agreement, you have a circle here, and they converge together to some extent into the purchase contract, right? You shouldn't be amending either of the existing agreements just to satisfy this agreement. This agreement should stand on its own, right? So, and here's the reason in the thought process is if you modify the listing agreement to accommodate for the purchase, the negotiation that you're going through, what happens if that falls apart? Yeah, then you've just set a new floor, right, for the seller. It's similar to, I'll give you this example because I've been in contact, I think with you actually, Lay, and we resolved it. I've been in conversations with lenders sometimes that will ask me, right? And the lender will go, hey, we're obviously helping the buyer get financing. And it says on the buyer rep agreement, 3 pineapples, but in the purchase contract, it says 2. So go ahead. Well, this is why I don't want you to do that, but they'll say, go ahead and amend the buyer rep agreement and lower it to 2. And here's my commentary on that is that's not what the buyer rep agreement is it establishes agency, right? It creates an agency agreement that comments on compensation. It's an agency agreement that says, here's the ceiling in which the buyer will pay. It could be the exact amount, but it's setting the ceiling. You can't earn more, but could you accept less? The answer is yes, right? In that case, if a lender is saying, amend that, well, what happens again? Same scenario. What happens if this purchase contract doesn't work out or the negotiation doesn't work out? If you've amended it down, if can't, well, the answer is, can you amend it down? The answer is yeah, you can, but you cannot amend it up. So now you've just accepted a lower compensation transactionally for something that never even came to fruition. So just so you know, as a rule of thumb, if you're accepting less than, you should do so on an escrow instruction. That's a transactional document. Escrow instructions, right? Not the buyer up agreement. There, by the way, there are a lot of schools of thought on this. I'm just talking to you from a legal and contractual perspective. That's not what that document is for, right? Because the listing agreement is not transactional. It's agency document that's creating the opportunity for a listing agent to have that listing or do all the marketing for the listing and negotiate and so forth. On the buyer rep side, it's establishing the agency relationship so that you can negotiate. It's talking about an agency. It's not talking about a transaction. The purchase contract is where it becomes transactional as well as the escrow instructions for that transaction. Does that make sense? I did not. We didn't do that because I was on the phone with the CFO and I explained it and he was pushing back and I said, put me in touch with your legal team and I'll explain the same thing because I worded it to them as it's the same thing as if I go in there and say your underwriters are wrong. They should be underwriting it like this. You're going to go, hey, stay out of my lane, please. Right. And I said, so likewise, stay out of our lane. You're interfering with our agency document. You had a question on Zoom?
Yes. Hi, Chad. This is Ted. So I understood way back very clearly what you just helped reiterate, which is like on the buyer rep form, it's better to go 3% instead of 2.5% because you can always negotiate down.
Yeah.
And in this scenario, I'm not disagreeing whatsoever, but I was curious to understand the mechanics. Like, why couldn't you? Why can't you increase the commission back to 3 if you, or even cancel the contract and start a new one? What's going on there? Is it important for us to understand that?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Let me explain it this way: is it's not a matter of legality. So I want to make sure everyone knows it's not illegal to raise the buy rep agreement. That's our brokerage's policy, and the reason why is it sets the tone to ensure that our agents aren't being predatory. Because here's what's I have 300 agents, so I have to manage and supervise 300 agents and ensure that we're doing things with the right ethics and integrity. Right outside of the brokerage, I'm already hearing there are agents that go, "Oh, I'm only going to put $500 on the buy rep agreement," and then they enter into negotiations, and then they either amend or draft a new buy rep agreement to accommodate the exact amount that's being offered in compensation. And it's not a matter of legality, but what it does do is that if ever they're audited, 100% they're going to get they're liable for damages for sure, 100%, without a doubt. And so, from a brokerage policy, we have to maintain some level of integrity, and that line is you can adjust it down, right? Because if you adjust it down, you're benefiting the buyer, but adjusting it up, don't do that. So what you should do is just aim high. And in Ted's example, three, pineapples. But also, guys, please don't forget, I created an addendum, a KW addendum to the buy rep agreement that specifically states we can accept as an agent, as a brokerage, and as an agent less than what's indicated on section 10A. So that is the document. If someone's like, well, can you put it in writing? That's a document that specifies that. It's the KW addendum to the buy rep agreement. It's a 2-page document that I created. Gosh, I don't know, when did I create that? Like six months ago or so. Yeah. It's in is it in zip forms yet? I don't remember. We'll send it out to everybody here again. And so that document basically just reaffirms some of the things that are in the NAR settlement as well as the buy rep agreement, but it also in writing gets into we will accept less than. So if anyone's having trouble explaining that to a client, that document's helpful.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Yeah.
Like whatever the contract is, what should have been, like the lender said nothing to do with what my agreement is with my buyer, right?
Yeah, so Lay's question is the lender asking, she feels is like, well, why are they even asking? Because it has nothing to do with them. The reason why is because lenders are like almost overly cautious. And what they're trying to look for is that while the buyer is your client, the buyer is also their client. So, you know what I mean? There's two different things that are happening at the same time. And for them, they want to ensure they have to account for any debt and obligations and money to close. So from a federal guideline perspective, they're just making sure that there's nothing happening behind the scenes, like you're kind of pocketing money or they're pocketing money. So they need to account for every dollar. And that's unfortunately, that's part of the Patriot Act. No, unless a lender asks for it, I would never submit a buyer rep agreement to any party except for title and escrow if they ask for it. But that's for an internal document. That's for our brokerage. If a lender's asking for it, you can just ask, well, why do you need that? Here's the escrow instructions in lieu of that, or whatever the case is, right? Because then what happens is other people are going to try to step in and police the agency. Policing the agency meaning like I've had some listing agents say, I'm not going to allow you to show my property unless I can see your buyer rep agreement, which is bananas. It's crazy to even think of a listing agent would try to police that. That's not their job to police that. In the same way as if they said that to me, I would say, well, great, show me your listing agreement then. Right. And they would be like, oh, how dare you? Right. Same thing. It's the same agreement, but on opposite sides.
Is there a proper way to cover the gap for their client? If the sort of addenda says we could request the seller to compensate for the difference, reduce their own compensation to match the seller's offered compensation.
Yeah.
But there's no, this is outside of the purchase contract. There's no guarantee that the buyer's agent won't go after that one pineapple from the buyer.
Yeah, but you can do so. There's a lot of things that you can do. For instance, the
not hear the question.
The question was, how do you cover the gap? Who asked the question, by the way? Who said that? Zoom. So the question was, how do you cover the gap? So if in fact on the buyer rep agreement section 10A, it says 3 pineapples. on the purchase contract section C4, it says 2 pineapples. How do you ensure to the buyer that that gap will be covered? That's the escrow instructions, because the escrow instruction says what your commissions are, and it's signed by a broker. You know what I mean? So if a buyer needs to see that, you can give them a copy of that. Certainly escrow is more than 5. I've spoken to escrow officers of the different escrow companies on island as well. Is this satisfactory to use? And I explained that whole thing, and so everyone's fine with it. If someone's not, it's typically that agent or that broker on the other side, or lender, or whatever it is. I don't want, and this is a confusing time for everybody, by the way. The NAR settlement is a national issue, and everyone's trying to revisit their policies and guidelines and so forth. The main thing for us is to be professional, understand kind of what the statutes are, what the rules are, and get me involved. I'm more than happy to have a conversation. I did that with, you know, almost everyone here that had an issue that came up. I'm absolutely on the phone with them and helping you to resolve it. Okay, so moving on to the purchase contract, we'll go through, but those are great questions. Any more, please throw them. Yes, just kidding. We're not moving on. Yeah. Yeah, so her question was, what if in the case that she does want to collect the difference instead of, you know, give back that difference, or yeah. That would also be on the escrow instructions. And what will happen is every escrow company is going to generate a different document that states that the buyer has to bring in that extra amount. So it's not like the buyer's going to come to the closing table and like, by the way, you owe 10 grand. They're going to know that at the opening of escrow, because escrow is going to give them a document that states that they're agreeing to bring in compensation. The lender needs that as well. Yeah. So we're going to go through each section, comprehend each section and its use. We'll go kind of high level, 30,000 feet. Understand the need to complete the document to represent your clients effectively. Anticipate, identify, resolve potential red flags. Is there anything, I don't know if anyone said anything on Zoom. Is there anyone, nothing? Okay. Let me know if there's things that you guys absolutely want to or need to know. When you're looking at the purchase contract, make sure that you're looking at the current document. To the left unhighlighted, it says it's revised date, and then for the release date. So right now we're looking at the 1 October 24. So if you're using 824 or any other version of that, you are using an older version. Make sure that you have one up to date. So obviously you can get that clearly on zip forms. Why would you use a different one? Is that if you're literally having your own template and you haven't updated it. So don't use your own templates. Please use ours. I take time to create them for you. If you notice, the purchase contract is organized by sections, section A through T. And an example is section A is agency, B is earnest money, G is title, T is acceptance, and so on and so forth. There's going to be initials at the bottom of each page and signatures required on the last page, as well as addenda and disclosures. So guys, the purchase contract is between the buyer and the seller. The buyer and the seller. It is not between the brokerages, right? So technically speaking, you know how on the top of the purchase contract, what's there on the top? It's a signature line for who? For a broker to sign, right? A BIC or a PB or what have you. Is that required for that document to be binding? Legally, it's not required. Believe it or not, as scary as that is not required for that to be binding. We don't allow that because obviously a broker should be reviewing it first before it goes out. But that's just to illustrate that it's still a binding document. It's still a binding agreement if a buyer and seller sign. What are the buyer and seller referred to as legally? Is the principles to the contract. They're the principles to the contract. It allows the buyer the opportunity, which is escrow in the purchase contract. It allows the buyer the opportunity to determine if they want to purchase the property based on inspections and document review. So what does that refer to as? It's basically due diligence, right? So if a buyer walks in and establishes either a 30 or maybe a 45-day, 60-day escrow, whatever that is, that time frame is entirely set up for the buyer to do due diligence. The buyer is going to get closer to deciding whether this property is exactly what I thought it was and everything checks out by way of home inspection, by way of appraisal, by way of reviewing the title documents and so on and so forth, right? So all the while they're getting closer to understanding, you know, what the ins and outs of the property is. And typically, if you've done a good job as an agent, a buyer's agent, the buyer will know more about the property than the seller does by the time you close. Right? Especially if and by the way, it doesn't even matter how long the sellers live there. If they've lived there 20 or 30 years, the buyer still will probably know more about the property in terms of inspections and so forth. Deadlines and obligations are created, which are also referred to as what? Deadlines and obligations, contingencies. Specific termination provisions allow parties to terminate under specific conditions and specify consequences of termination. So we've talked about how you can terminate and where you can terminate, right? Termination is sections, what? O. What does O stand for? That's what Ray was adding. Yeah, then you're right. We have a child in the room, so the Disney version is oh. That's right. Or oh crap for adults. It's 01, 02, 03, right? That's how you terminate. So if there is someone that's trying to terminate and are not referencing either one of those provisions, you cannot terminate. So there's a copyright on there. It's also obviously reviewed by a broker. Just know that, and we've come across a scenario just as recently as just this morning, is there are some times where you might represent a customer on one side, or you represent the client, but there's a customer on the other side. Customers don't have fiduciary responsibility. We don't have duty of instruction. They also should not be using our documents. So they shouldn't be completing it on their own. We can help guide them along. They can seek help from some other person, but they shouldn't be using our documents, and we shouldn't be aiding and abetting providing them blank documents. So quick tip, before you write an offer, you should be calling the listing agent. Obviously, proper communication. Have any listing agents here can probably attest to, isn't it weird? I mean, you want to sell your home, but isn't it strange when you have a listing and you just receive an offer in the inbox and you're like, what the heck, did this person even see it? I didn't get a phone call or let me know an offer was coming in. You kind of question it even more, right? So good communication is important. When you call the listing agent, you should be asking a couple of things. Do you have any offers in hand? If so, how many and how strong? Right? Because wouldn't that possibly change the focus on how you draft it and some of the contingencies you put in there? When are you presenting the offers to the seller? Besides price, what's important to the seller? Can you check Big Trap? Are there any pertinent items to disclose? By the way, if you're on the listing side, you should be putting some of those things in the MLS. Like I would have the SRPDS uploaded in supplements or survey uploaded in supplements. So section A, as we discussed, it goes in a certain order. A1 establishes agency. Agency is who represents who. Like, are we representing the seller, representing the buyer, or in that example, was it dual agency? Section A2, which is the part that you would complete, is whoever it is on the MLS. If it's on the MLS, 99% of the time it would be, you would indicate that brokerage firm. Then on the buy side, if you're the one drafting it, you would indicate Keller Williams Honolulu. Or in the case of dual agency, if that's a scenario, I know there's some other islands that are on, different brokerages that are on as well. For Keller Williams Honolulu, anyways, we do recognize designated agency. So the process, as you guys know, is A2A and B would be NA. A2C would be check. And then Keller Williams Honolulu by way of designated agency, if that's what it is. And for us, Keller Williams Honolulu, 9 out of 10 times it's going to be designated agency and not dual agency. By the way, that there's a huge difference between the two. Designated agency is far safer for you as an agent, and it's better for the client. Dual agency handcuffs you as an agent, where you can't provide any inside information or real consultative advice to either side. So be aware of that. Members agree to adhere to and uphold NAR standards of practice and code of ethics. And obviously, one of the biggest changes that we have now is buyer representation agreement, at least, is required. That has to be established before you show a property. And it certainly has to be established before you're writing the offer, just so you guys know. So when you're submitting an offer to your broker, your BIC, your PB, whomever, make sure that you include your buyer rep agreement in it, even though it's already been signed, because how do we know? We're looking at contracts all day long. We have no idea if it's signed. And what we're looking at too is what it says, what the date is, what it says on 10A versus what you're asking for in C4. So there's a little bit of kind of quick audit that the brokers are doing as well. Did you check the chat? Okay. Yes. Yes, the question was, KW Honolulu anyways, has another document that belongs in section D1. On top of the HER version of designated agency, we have a KW designated agency. Just so you know, it's not redundant. It sounds redundant. It's not. The reason why we have both is that if you notice, A2, it's not properly done. What it should say is seller, buyer, dual agency, designated agency. It should separate the two out, and it doesn't. So therefore, our document makes room for and acknowledging that issue. It's not redundant. It is necessary. Thank you for asking.
Even the HER document.
It's not proficient. Yeah, I wish that it were. You know, we want to lean into anything HER as much as possible, but it's not perfect. So when it's not perfect, we try to supplement it with our own documents. So you're sitting at an open house for your seller, and an unrepresented buyer walks in and wants you to help them purchase a property. How should you proceed? Okay, one person says treat them as a customer. Lay says sign them to a buyer rep agreement. So the first thing, number one, before you do anything at all, should be, did the seller even grant you permit? Because if you sign a listing agreement, which is why you'd even be sitting in open house, does it state on there that they're okay with a dual agency? Right? There's a checkbox on the listing agreement. So if the answer is yes, they're okay with it, then you can have a conversation of either dual agency, or if you're on a team or you partner with one of our KW agents, you might want to then establish a designated agency. Do you need a buyer rep agreement signed for them to walk in and look at the home? Yeah, the answer is no. Now, if they walk in and said, I want you to, I mean, it's nuanced based on the scenario, but in the unlikely event that they go, hey, Lay, I've heard so much about you. I'd like for you to represent me as my agent. Obviously, before anything happens at that point, you then need a buyer rep agreement, because now you're creating, with the intent of representing them, you're creating an agency, right? But if they're just looking at it, they were brought to the open house on their own, not because you're bringing them there and touring, they don't need one to look at the home. But going forward, you do. Okay, earnest money deposit. Earnest money deposits are a great way to negotiate a contract. It's one of the few components that show the strength of an offer. So here's the thing to keep in mind. Everyone is on B1. This is the amount of days that's on there. I'm not overly concerned about this. This section here for earnest money deposit, section C2, will indicate what that amount is, right? I'll give you an example. If you have, it kind of coincides with the purchase price. Would you guys agree? Right? You're going to put a different amount in there if it's a $10 million purchase versus a $1 million purchase versus a $200,000 purchase, right? Obviously. Some people use a rule of thumb. It should be 1%. It should be 5%. There's not really a rule of thumb. It should coincide with what your clients' goals and priorities are, what kind of financing they have, because that plays into it as well. But also understand that whatever you indicate in there, they are going to part ways with that money. That money will leave their hands, leave their account, and go into escrow. Escrow is a neutral third party. Are they guaranteed to get that money back if they cancel with one of their rightful contingencies? Yeah. In other words, if I say, because I've had this before, right? I've had a client I've represented that was making a purchase of upwards of 2 million. They want, and we're competing. And they said, I'm paying all cash. Let's go ahead and put $1 million earnest money to kind of beat out the other offers. Is that a strong offer? Yeah. Is that putting their best foot forward? Yes. Is it safe for them to do that? But why? It says if they cancel for J1, it says, don't they need the sellers to sign off? That's absolutely correct. Yeah. So here's the issue. You're absolutely correct, Leigh. So here's the issue. Is while the contract represents as such that the buyer has many opportunities and contingencies to terminate, what happens in practice, in actuality? Right? Have you guys ever canceled? But the first thing that happens is escrow goes, we're going to send out cancellation instructions. And whose signatures are required on that set of instructions? Both principals, right? The buyer and the seller. And so if your J1 period says 10 days and you terminated within 3 days, in theory, does the buyer have the right to cancel? Should they get their earnest money returned? But what if the seller doesn't agree? That happened, that exact same scenario happened to me before. And so what escrow does is they go, okay, you guys figure it out, let us know. Figure it out and let us know. So I'm going to come back to that in a second, but why is that important to understand? Because what you put into initial earnest money deposit, understand that your client is parting ways with that money. So while you want to make a strong push, a strong offer, there's a risk involved there as well. So let's say that you want to put, let's say we're talking about a $2.5 million purchase. And they say, let's put $250,000 earnest money, which is appropriate for that size, right? Instead of that, why don't you put 50,000 into initial deposit and remaining 200 after what? After what time frame? What's the number one? 70% of all terminations in escrow occur in what contingency? In J1. So if it occurs in J1, you can still accomplish that $250,000 deposit if that's what the instruction is from the client, but separate that out in a much safer way. 50,000 initial, 200 after J1 expiration, for instance, right? That makes sense? Here's my question to you guys is, what happens if buyer and seller can't agree for any length of time on the return of the earnest money deposit? What's the legal method that occurs to resolve that matter? So again, there's money in escrow. Buyer and seller are not agreeing to what's happening. Escrow's holding the money as a neutral third party. What's the legal process that takes place after a certain amount of time to decide what happens with the funds? Oh, she's so close. Close. Not mediation. Not arbitration. What does she put? Interloper. I think that's what you do in Vegas when you've had too many drinks. No, she's close. It's called interpleader. I'm just kidding, Jenny. Interpleader. And so interpleader is a legal process.
That's not stated anywhere.
It has nothing to do with our purchase. So Nepali is asking, where does it state that? It has nothing to do with our documents. It has everything to do with escrow. That's how escrow functions. So interpleader is a legal process by which escrow will hire either a law firm, an attorney, or what have you, to basically represent them as the escrow company. Look at the documents, go seek court approval for a court to decide the disbursement of the funds. Here's the rub with that. By the way, there's no opt-out to that, just so you know. That's what it is. Here's the rub to interpleader. Interpleader pays itself before it releases the remaining proceeds. And what interpleader costs depends entirely on the complexity of the argument. Right? So at minimum, it could cost $5,000. We had Shannon here from First Hawaii Title not that long ago, and she said she's seen interpleader costs over $100,000. So the issue is you have 250,000. No one can decide on where it goes. Your client is rightfully, should be rightfully the recipient of that full refund. Seller disagrees. It goes to interpleader. Interpleader decides in favor of your buyer. Your buyer should receive 100%. Oh, fantastic. Less the fees of interpleader, so they get 150 or whatever the thing is. Right. So my point in saying that is not to scare anyone from making any earnest money deposit, but you got to understand what the consequences are of putting high deposits in, or certainly after certain guidelines. Now, please also be aware of market conditions. The current landscape of the market, we aren't in how many people are competing? I mean, it happens, but what I'm saying is, are we competing in the same way as we were 3 years, 4 years, 6 years ago? Different, right? Where before you could write an offer and easily, I've done this before, write an offer and go, yeah, we have 22 offers in hand right now, or 10 offers in hand, or whatever it is. Are you guys experiencing that? If the answer is no, write your offer appropriate to market conditions. Stop competing with yourself, right? So if there's no other offers in hand, why are you in that same scenario? Why would you put 250,000 in jeopardy? So again, it starts with that phone call. Do you have any offers in hand? How strong are they? The answer is no, we don't have any offers in hand. It's been on the market for 90 days, whatever the thing is, right? Scrap the whole idea of putting down 250. Maybe you make the entirety of that initial deposit 50 or 25 or something safer, because now you're in control. We're so used to the sellers being in control of the negotiation, we forget how to write a contract where the market has shifted in some areas. Okay, so bear that in mind. Another thing I want to mention too is by way of. By way of is used if there's financing. If it's all cash, don't put by way of cash. The amount of the cash should be up one line. Total cash funds received from buyer, exclusive of closing costs. By way of is reserved for like 30-year fixed, right? Have you guys seen the term 30-year fixed with rates and terms acceptable to buyer? You guys have seen that? Doesn't matter. She's asking if you would change it to prevailing. I've seen different versions of it. Prevailing rates with rates no higher than 7%, right? With rates and terms acceptable to buyer, they're all the same thing. But because really the point is, my question to you is, can you cancel on that? So with rates and terms acceptable to buyer, right? Doesn't matter what the rate is, because I've just put rates and terms acceptable to buyer, and I represent the buyer. The buyer's not happy with the rate and term that they get based on with rates and terms acceptable to buyer. Can I terminate? Why? I get yes, I get no. Hold on. Zoom. So once this based on financing, I got yes and no's. It smells like margaritas in here, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. What do people that on Zoom think? Can you terminate based on with rates and terms acceptable to buyer?
No,
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Oh, I love it.
I say no.
Yes.
I love that kind of answer. So the answer is no. You may not terminate just based upon with rates and terms acceptable to buyer. So Nepali, you're correct in that that's not the provision. I'm talking only about that line because I've seen people point to C2 with rates and terms acceptable to buyer and terminate. Now, in our industry, we're infamous for, no, that's not accurate because I've done it before. Have you heard that? No, I've done that many times. You can have done that for 30 years straight. I'm telling you, you've done it wrong, right? You just haven't been checked on it. So legally, I'm just talking about contract law. You cannot terminate based upon that language. And the reason is it has to reference 01, 02, or 03. 01, 02, 03. Part of contract law, everyone is something called consideration. Do you guys know what consideration is? What's consideration? Is what? It's the earnest money, right? Have you ever tried to open up escrow and not had the escrow won't open? It's a soft open because they're like, we don't have any earnest money. We have no deposit. You need that deposit in order for that contract to be valid. So 01, 02, or 03 addresses damages and the return of the deposit, which is crucial and super important. So if you notice, every legal method in which a buyer or seller can terminate the contract references 01, 02, or 03. If it doesn't reference that, that is not a point that someone can terminate. Let me ask you this. So jumping forward to validate my point on this, can someone terminate based upon the final walkthrough? I'm saying this because I hear both ways. I mean, when I hear you guys have conversations, I hear it. So a buyer comes in, there's nuances, and we'll kind of talk about that. But a buyer comes in, do the final walkthrough. I'm sure everyone who's been doing this for 10 years plus has seen this before. The buyer's like, oh my gosh, this is terrible, and that's terrible, and the cleaning's not done, and there's a hole here, and so on and so on and so on. Simply, the question is solely based upon the final walkthrough. Can a buyer terminate? I'm getting those in the room. What about on Zoom? Can a buyer terminate based upon the findings of the final walkthrough?
I forget if there's a O at the bottom of that J section.
Yeah, so if there's not a 01, 02, 03 on J3 of the purchase contract, which by the way, there's not, you cannot terminate. You cannot terminate based upon the findings of the final walkthrough. Now, the buyer does have rights. The buyer's rights to being unsatisfied with the final walkthrough is what? Is J4. So the buyer's remedy to J3 is J4. And J4 is what? What's that? It's a withholding. It's a withholding of 150% of the estimated cost to repair. So there is a remedy, but it's not to terminate. Now, here's the nuance to it. If anyone gets overly technical about it, is what if there's a material fact issue that came up on the final walkthrough that wasn't there prior? Then it becomes a redisclosure. So now that goes back to I2 of the purchase contract, which can a buyer terminate using I2? Yes. So in some instances, you might be able to terminate, but it's not because of J3 or J4. It's because of a redisclosure. So cleaning, by the way, is not a redisclosure because that's a big, right? That comes up, which so a buyer being dissatisfied with the quality of the cleaning is not a reason a buyer can terminate. Okay, moving on, understand your buyer's needs, make sure that you have things in there correctly in terms of the loan. And if there's now, we've seen second mortgages, HELOCs, home equity lines of credits, fixed seconds, that goes on the line underneath by way of, so make sure that you have that in there correctly. Yes.
They're prepaid in escrow, and then they wrote on for the mortgage and they track them down.
Yeah, that's her question is on certain loans, such as you'll see it a lot on VA and you'll see it a lot on USDA. Those are 100% financing loans because I mentioned before that an escrow or contract is not legal without consideration. So you would think 100% financing, I don't need to have earnest money. You have to, right? So she's saying underneath the by way of, you can either put a minus sign or you can put it in parentheses and back out that initial deposit and put on there to be returned to buyer for use of closing costs or whatever. Something like that. Is that legal or allowed? She asked, and that's absolutely allowed. So you can do that. So it can be used for closing costs, or it can be returned to buyer as buyer see fits. So that's totally allowed. The two things that were added in here that are newer is section C3 and C4. Obviously, C3 is a credit to the buyer for the buyer's use. That could be on a temporary buy down. So we would put typically, right? We would have done that in Q. Buyer wants credit of 20,000. Buyer wants buy down for 2, whatever the thing is, that goes in there now. So yeah. Yeah, it's a different section. That's in section H. She asked about hard money. Hard money is addressed in section H. And then C4, of course, is how you're going to be compensated, which is going to be more than likely used unless it's a co-op. Section D1, we obviously want to use HER forms as much as possible. We do have our own. If we do use a KW form, we're going to put that in other. One thing to keep in mind, which I see this happen more often than not, oddly enough, is it says fill in all blanks, right? NA if not applicable. And I often will see an X or check mark and everything else is blank. Why do you think in contract law, leaving a blank is inappropriate? Well, someone could have a nefarious intention and fill it in later. And how would you prove otherwise, right? So in contract law, You shouldn't leave anything blank, nothing. But also, just a word of caution too, have you also seen this in section Q, all blanks deemed NA? That is not appropriate language either. Because there are certain sections in the contract now that you could void out the whole section as a result of that. So don't use that. Just go in there and put NA into the specific areas or a dash to eliminate its use. E1, the description is pretty accurate. Our TMK is our parcel number, and it's unique to the property. Make sure that it's accurate. You can pull that up on public record. Inclusions, obviously you're going to put in NA for areas that don't apply. You should be checking this against what not only they have on the MLS, but hopefully if you as an agent have seen the property in person by way of a showing or open house or whatever that is, don't get tricky, because people try to get tricky. They're like, it said AC on the MLS, but there's no AC. So if I check it, then they're going to have to buy me an AC. Not really. You're just opening up a huge argument unnecessarily. So go with what is actually there. On the flip side of it, unfortunately, I've been in scenarios where I've listed a property for a client. They've indicated that they're leaving, like, for instance, the washer, dryer, fridge. They're in the military, and then it was taken during their PCS. What happens then? We opened up escrow with it there. It was physically there, and then it was removed in escrow. We had to pay for it, and unfortunately, that came out of my pocket because my clients couldn't afford it. So make sure that upon opening escrow, that's the marker, that's the timeline. So if you have it on the MLS and it's since been removed, it's gone, it's not there, and then they write the offer, you're okay, you're safe. You want to make sure your paperwork's accurate, but you're okay. But the moment that offer is written, it's whatever was in the property at the time it was written. That's your timeline. That's when your timeline begins. Section E3, which is on the other page, I'll get to that, is lease photovoltaic. E4 is inventory list. So on that section, on those inclusions of furnishings and those kind of things, that typically you'll see when it's a short-term rental, if things are included. Photovoltaic is pretty self-explanatory. Make sure that you review all the transfer documents and you get an updated maintenance agreement and all those other kind of things. Section F is closing. You want to make sure that the closing date, typically, what do we put in there? We put things like 30 days after acceptance, right? Which is kind of normal, to be delivered vacant, if that is in fact the case. What we don't want to put in there is or sooner. Have you guys seen that before? 30 days or sooner. Why do you think that language is a little difficult to enforce? Lady's falling asleep for her big lunch that she had. So why do you think or sooner? So that we have a brand new agent with us, brand new in Hawaii, said that he does that in Vegas all the time. So this is a great topic. So I'm talking law, contract law, right? Why that's not a good idea to have or sooner? Because my question to you is, let's say we put 30 days or sooner. And people here could say, well, we've done that before many times and we close it like that and blah, blah, blah. Here's the issue. What does or sooner mean? So let's say I'm paying cash 30 days. You still occupy the property. In 3 days, I go, hey, I'm ready to close. You got to get out. And you're like, wait, time out. I haven't even moved out yet. I'm not done with anything yet. I don't agree with that. Now we have a conflict in our description for what or sooner means. That's a potential issue, right? So the point of that is could you successfully close on something that says or sooner? Here's what you guys are probably forgetting that you've done in the past. I'm not talking about Vegas, that's a different state, but here, you absolutely would have created an amendment to establish what or sooner means. And is an amendment unilateral or bilateral? It's bilateral, like both principals have to sign it to agree. So if both principals have to sign it to agree, why do you even have that language in there? It's not legally or contractually enforceable. So you're better off just putting 30 days after acceptance. And should you need to close sooner, just have an amendment that states whatever that new date is, sooner or later, whatever you're looking at. But or sooner on its own, or and or on or before, or whatever that is not contractually enforceable because it doesn't establish a true date. And what your version of or sooner is might be different than the other party.
How much do you press if you're the seller? And that's the only thing that needs to be changed in the buyer's contract.
I do. I would so Nepali's question was how much do you press on that if you're the listing agent and you receive an offer and that's the only change that's in there? Personally, I would in fact push back on that because it's like a honeymoon, right? When you're dating, everything seems hunky. No problem, we're gonna work with you or whatever the case is, but that could end up what seems to be small right now could end up to be a big point of argument where things start to fall apart as a result of it. I would much rather have everything buttoned up in writing so that we don't have any issues. We also include and delivered vacant, if in fact that is the case. Obviously, if it's a rental property, you don't need that. F3 has changed, as you guys know, that's had different iterations. So the newest version of that updated in August is either party may extend up to however many days. Either party can extend it until that whatever amount of days in there is used up. So whereas before you could use it and burn it, right? So if I had 10 days in there and Lay used 1 day, that entire provision is done. Neither party can use it. Now, however, if you put 10 days in there and Lay uses 1 day, either Lay or I have 9 days remaining. And I use 2 days, either Lay and I have 7 days remaining. That's kind of a scary thing. So, yeah, and who does this harm most? Extensions. It's the buyer. It harms the buyer most, and more often than not, right? Because of lock extensions, if there's financing involved. So whereas F3A was typical to have 10 days in there before, I would highly recommend you reconsider that, either to a lower amount like 5 days, or use what people are, whatever reason are so scared of using, which is time is of the essence. Everyone's like, oh my God, time is like, yeah, it's contract. Time is always of the essence. But time is of the essence doesn't mean that you can't just have an amendment and extend. You can do that too. So use it, understand what that is and what the consequences are and use it the right way. But 10 days is probably detrimental to your buyer if they have financing. Or if you do put something like 10 days, you might want to communicate that right with the lender, if there's a lender. Okay. We're not going to do this, but I'll tell you, if you guys use, if you are doing your own transaction, trying to figure out what the dates are, number one is day one begins when? Next day, right? The day after acceptance. Day one begins day after acceptance. If you go to datetime.com, there's a calculator. It's a free calculator. You can put that in there and it will calculate all those things. So you can figure out, does it fall on a weekend? Does it fall on a holiday? Those things are sometimes very, very important, especially every transaction is time sensitive, but there are some that are even more time sensitive. Maybe it's a 1031 exchange or what have you. So you want to make sure that you're looking at your deadlines right. Section F, moving on to conveyance tax. They've separated this out. Make sure that you select whether it's owner occupied or not. Assessments are super important. If you know of an assessment, this is also why you want to call the listing agent ahead of time to find out what that is. But you want to make sure that you understand what those assessments are. Clearly, you have an opportunity to discover assessments by way of the SRPDS as well as the condo docs, but you want to know them up front. On the listing side, if you know of an assessment, you obviously want to, if it were me, I'd post it on the MLS. Working keys at closing. There is a one key that needs to be delivered but per the contract. If you need additional keys, you should put that in section. Should do that in section what, E2? Yeah, E2. Sorry, having a brain fart. G1 is preliminary title report. Some things that's changed in this is in the whole section G in title is we as agents cannot hold on to documents that might prolong inadvertently the close of escrow. So there's a common, I don't know if you want to call it a strategy that was used in the past where you might go to sign documents and as a buyer's agent, you pull a SAT waiver. Have you guys heard of that before? I'm going to hold a SAT waiver. I'm kind of holding it ransom for whatever reason, because I didn't like what I saw on the final walkthrough, whatever the case is. By doing that, and if you inadvertently delayed closing because escrow's like, we need the SAT waiver, otherwise we can't close, you've just breached contract. You've just breached. So that's not a strategy that you should be employing. There's other methods in the contract that are already designed, like the withholding, as we discussed before. Pulling the SAT waiver should not be one of them. In addition, I'm going to give you another example on the listing side. Have you guys had trusts before that you listed and you realize, oh shoot, I need a death certificate, I need a full trust? You didn't gather or deliver those things to title and escrow prior to taking the listing, right? And as a result of that, maybe it's in land court or whatever, and it's causing a delay, you've just breached. So it doesn't mean that the whole thing will fall apart, but it absolutely means that it could. And if it did fall apart, that's your fault, whomever you represent. So if you don't have title and escrow documents in a timely fashion that caused the delay, you just breached for your client. That language was not in there in its prior iteration, and it is now, so you should know that. Yes. Yeah. Who does? Oh, Michael Kohler. SAT waiver is just short for satisfaction waiver. It's an escrow document that escrow puts, all escrows use it, and it basically says that the buyer is acknowledging that they're satisfied with the funding, all the contingencies and everything else, because that's typically like one of the last things that they're going to sign, and it's usually 1 or 2 pages, and we refer to it as a SAT waiver. And so like the strategy that I'd mentioned before that old school agents would use is just pulling and holding the SAT waiver and then emailing it to escrow later, especially when they're trying to renegotiate something after a final walkthrough. That's what a SAT waiver is, or satisfaction waiver. Don't use it in that way. H1, it talks about attaching the loan approval, pre-qual, whatever that might be in there. Also the proof of funds that you're going to be using. We've talked about ways to and not to do it. If you're going to, it's not a good idea to have bank statements, I'll tell you. The reason why is that's like playing poker and oversharing your hand, right? So if you have a loan, or rather you're putting down a down payment of 200,000 and you have a bank statement that shows 3 million in there. I mean, it's strong, but it doesn't necessarily help you in terms of negotiation, especially if you're not putting down full price, especially if you understand as a buyer's agent that your negotiation doesn't stop once escrow's open. Isn't it true that sometimes after a home inspection, you might go back to the negotiating table and go, hey, listen, my buyer wants this, that, and the other thing. Trust me, they're going to remember that they got $3 million in the bank. Like, why are you asking me to fix this and that? They have this money sitting there. That's one way. The other way I've seen it work against somebody is you're making a $2 million offer, but it's a VA, right? That's entitled to 100% financing or whatever it is. And in their bank, they have $3,000. Large purchase, but only 3,000. Does that bode well for them? Not necessarily, right? So it depends on the subjectivity of the listing agent and the seller. So I would not use a bank statement if you can avoid it. If you have to, please redact the account number. Try to use lender verification if at all possible. That's far better. If, by the way, you put on here, it's due after, buyer will provide the items indicated below as evidence within certain amount of days, and then the seller has within X amount of days to review it. I've seen people put like 5 days to review it. That means that you're leaving the window open for 5 days for a seller to terminate on the buyer. Why would they do that? They got a stronger offer. So either make that 1 day or NA that second part. So again, that strategy, you can figure out how to best use that. The first, you can put as many days as you want on there. Usually within 1 to 5 days is reasonable. The second part, I would put NA or 1 day. Anything more than that, you're giving yourself too much wiggle room for someone to terminate. If you notice right under here, it says choose paragraph H1 or paragraph H2. So it's telling you or. I would say that there's an opportunity or a scenario that you could use both. So one is with contingency on obtaining cash funds, and the other one is no contingency on obtaining cash funds. Where would be a scenario where you might indicate both H1 and H2? Yeah, so Napoli was saying additional deposit might be coming from somewhere that needs an approval. So here's one. I'll give you another example too. This is an easy one. Is what if I need to sell my property in order to buy? So immediately you think that's H2, right? I got to sell my existing property in order to purchase. But I do have $500,000 in the bank. And I'm going to use that as earnest money deposit. So you can verify that right now. That's a scenario that H1 and H2 would both apply. So I'm making a stronger offer. I'm saying, hey, you can verify my 500, but I got to sell my property at $1 million for the remainder, or whatever the case is. So that would where H1 and H2 would apply. H3 is financing. H4 is the obligation section. By the way, I forgot to mention H2. To Crystal's point, she asked about hard money. Hard money, if you guys can see on Zoom, is right here. This part has been added, which is great because typically if you're working with an investor, in the past, people would write it as hard money, same as cash. And I can promise you, there's no such universe that hard money is the same as cash at all, ever. Then you have here H, yes.
Just going back to H1, H2
Yes.
scenario you just said, I'm still not, my brain is not catching that. If I'm receiving an offer with both of those checked,
Yes.
they've got two contingencies.
Yeah, so we're looking at it, you know, what a good realtor is going to be giving you contrary advice depending on who we represent, the buyer or seller. Just like an attorney, right? They're going to give you contrary advice depending on who our client is. In this case, we're talking about a buyer, so we're the buyer's agent. We're looking at it through the lens of a buyer's agent. And in the lens of a buyer's agent, is it good or bad to have as many contingencies as possible for the buyer?
Good.
Good, right, it's good. Now, when you switch hats, as Ted has mentioned, if I'm looking at it from a listing agent, then that's a different strategy altogether. So from the listing side, I might want to eliminate contingencies, not add contingencies, right? There's certain things that you can't help. For instance, if they send you the example that I gave, H1 and H2 is actually neutral. It's a strong offer. And for you as a listing agent, it didn't put you in a bind. Number one, I get to verify the money that they already have. And if I don't like it, I can cancel, right? Based upon what I'd indicated there. So on the listing side, if I wrote you an offer, Ted, and I put in 5 days that I have to send in, this is talking about H1A in this section right here, if you guys can see that blue dot. If I put in here 5 days and I put here 0 or NA, the smart thing for you to do, Ted, might be to counter back and make this 2 days and make this 5 days, right? That subtle change completely swung the pendulum in the other way, especially if you might think that you might be getting another offer. On this side, though, it depends on what that contingency is based on. So if it's selling another property, that offer already is weak. I mean, it is what it is, right? But if I have to sell another property, because the other question I would have if I'm the listing agent, well, where's the property? What market? What state? Is it listed? How long? How is it priced well? Like, there's so many questions that can go along with that. And depending on the answer is what I might ask for based on H2. So if it's subject to sale of another property and it's in Seattle, Washington, and it's already listed, my first question is, I need comps. I need the name of your realtor. I need to see the listing agreement. I need to see the MLS on how long it's been on the market. There's other things that I wouldn't just go, okay, no problem. It's based on the sale. I mean, because then you're tied up in escrow for who knows what. But that's the lens of the listing agent. The lens on the buyer agent is, I'm like, here's H1, here's H2. You can verify my 500,000, but also it's contingent upon the sale of this other property. Let's move on. Right? We're looking at it with different degrees of liability.
Okay, I get it now. I just don't like the language that one says no contingency of cash flows, and one literally says we have a contingency, but it's there for a reason, I guess. So you just have to.
It's there for a reason, but a contingency is created in either circumstance, meaning on the list side, you as a seller have this right here. That amount allows you to kick them out. So the other thing too is the strategy is if you don't like it, Ted, you can make this some absurd amount. You can put in there like 30 days.
Yeah.
That means you can literally boot them out for a full 30 days. So it depends. If the buyer really wants that property, they'll take it. So that didn't hurt the seller. It actually hurts the buyer and keeps the seller safe. So the keep in mind that the purchase contract is a chessboard. Right? Well, someone else might be playing checkers, you're playing chess. You're like 5 steps ahead if you understand if I do this, then this is the consequence. If I do that, then this is the consequence. Okay,
Hey,
Joe.
Chad.
Yes.
Hey, this is Lee Potts on Maui.
Hi, Lee.
Hey, and I'm kind of coming in here with Ted because the way I look at this is if you made a cash offer and you select both H1 and H2, what that says to me is you don't have the cash. You're hoping to get the cash. So I would just, that doesn't sound like a cash offer to me. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, I understand. H2 is it's subject to, right? The remaining balance is subject to something.
Yeah.
H1 is you're still trying to show the seller that you're verifying whatever portion of the down payment. So it adds to the perception of strength of offer. You don't have to use it.
I hear what you're saying.
You don't by any means have to use it. I'm just saying if you do use it, that's the thought process or the strategy or intention. That's it.
Okay.
Maybe Chad,
you.
would this make sense, like in Q, just to mention that section H1 refers to X amount of dollars towards the total purchase price, so that they know which portion doesn't have a contingency on it, and then it kind of explains the contradiction between the two.
Yeah, you can, or you can just refer to it if you're using H1 to verify only the initial deposit and additional, then you can just state that. It can be stated as such. But yes, you can specify the amount, you can specify what portion of the cash you're referencing.
Okay, I get the idea though. Makes sense.
Section I is seller disclosure, super important. You know, there's a lot of ways, so I'm going to kind of switch hats in two ways here. So if you're writing the offer, in my opinion, I1 and I2. I1, you should be receiving the seller's SRPDS as quickly as possible. I oftentimes see that as like 10 or 15 days. The idea, if you have J1, let's say at 14 days, and you have this at 10 days, that's too far out. Like you want to have the seller disclosure, hopefully in your hands and reviewed, and maybe asking a few questions of the listing agent prior to the buyer having done their home inspection. That's the ideal approach. So my suggestion is 2 or 3 days at most for I1B. And then if you drop down to section I2, that's the amended disclosure. That should be 1 or 2 days because that's them amending it. So after they've already given you the initial SRPDS, the amended one comes after if there's an amended one, and that should be no more than 1 or 2 days. Now, I3 is where they made some changes on the last iteration. The changes that they made is they kind of rolled in I3B, which was like I4A and B with I3. So now it's all one. For better or worse, it's all one. So what I3B states is upon receipt of the disclosure statement, amended disclosure statement, or from the time the buyer discovers that the disclosure statement or amended disclosure statement fails to disclose a material fact. When do they discover that? When does the buyer typically discover that something is not accurate on the SRPDS? During their inspection, right? So just so everyone kind of wrap their head around this is I3B is saying from receipt of the disclosure or from receipt of the amended disclosure, right? Or from when the time frame that the buyer discovers is X amount of days. See it? X amount of days. So they rolled that all into one. I3A, upon receipt of disclosure statement, is just the acknowledgement of receipt, is rather meaningless. You're not waiving rights or anything like that at all. So if that said 1 or 2 days, you're not absolving the buyer from their opportunity to terminate. It's I3B is really important. Now, so again, strategy from the buyer side, you want that as long as possible within reason. 10 days, 15 days even, right? I3B. If I'm going to switch hats like Ted often does, is if I'm on the listing side, I want that as short as possible, right? I don't want to open up another window or 2 or 3 for an opportunity for the buyer to terminate. So here's another thing too. If what this is again just me as a listing agent, I would often show up to a home inspection. I'm not following around the home inspector and the buyer, that's their own private time. But I've let the home inspector in. And prior to them doing a debrief with the buyer, I will always ask, did you find anything major that I need to know about? 100% of the time, they're more than happy to tell you. They go, oh yeah, there's a leak over here and this over there, and they're all the things that they're telling you. And I'm taking mental note of it. I write it down and I let the seller know, let's redisclose right now. Because if I redisclose right now and that I3B, because again, I'm now on the sell side. We're on the buy side now, I'm on the sell side. If I3B, if I can get that down to just like 5 days, let's just say, did I open up a brand new window? I amended the disclosure. I acknowledge any material fact that might not have been on the original SRPDS that we discovered through the home inspection report by me being there. I've amended the SRPDS. We've already redisclosed it, and I didn't open up a new window. In fact, that window is probably going to close sooner than the buyer's original J1 window, if you did it at the same time. That's if you're on the list side, right? So you got to switch hats and look at the best. What's that?
Home inspector. I had one who went.
Oh, one that didn't. Oh, really? Napoli had a bad experience with the home inspector. Don't use that guy. Who's that guy? Let's put him on blast. Okay, any questions on I1, I2, I3? And the old, and this is actually a good thing because the old language was a little bit confusing on how they separated. It was like the buyer discovers something versus the seller discovers something. So they rolled it all into I3B. Let me skip through. Section I goes further into disclosures, mold, Megan's Law, flood zones, and so forth, lead-based paint. Then we get into J1. I will tell you, J1, I've seen it all different types of days that people put in there. And again, people are kind of competing with themselves. I still see J1 written with 5 days. Unless it's brand new construction or like built a week ago or something like that, you shouldn't be putting 5 days. How can you even get an inspector out there that quick? So the length of days that is in J1 should correspond with the age of the property, right? So if the property was built in 1900, hopefully you're not closing that quickly, but if it's built in 1900, maybe you should have like a 25-day J1, because you're probably not just doing a general home inspection. You might then have to come out and have the roof checked. If there's solar, you might want to have the solar checked. If there's a pool, that's a different inspector in most cases. So make sure that you put an appropriate amount of days in here relative to the property and its age and condition. All utilities have to be on. This potentially is an issue if you're dealing with foreclosures, sometimes short sales. J3.
Yeah, Chad, wait, back to J1. Can I ask?
Yes.
Please?
Yeah.
So
Can you-
I've had contradictory answers here because in your previous thing, it said at the end, buyer may cancel using O2. I've actually, it's rare, but I've heard of sellers hanging on to the deposit. Is that they definitely get it back in this particular new contract, or is it still a nebulous?
And I want to make sure I'm understanding correctly. So you're saying the buyer cancels with their rightful time using
Correct.
J1 and they're within their contingency. Is the buyer guaranteed to have their earnest money returned to them? Is that what you're asking?
Pretty much, yes, that's what I'm asking.
It goes back to exactly what I was describing before, which simply put, let me give you the example that I had personally. I've only had this happen like 2 or 3 times in my entire 25 years in real estate. I had an instance where we did a home inspection. It was within the time frame. Let's say the home inspection was 14 days. We did the home inspection in 5 days. We canceled in 6 days. Just on its surface, understanding that piece of information, does the buyer have the right to their return of their deposit? Yes. Right?
Yeah. Yes.
The seller claimed that we acted in bad faith and they did not sign off on the release of their earnest money deposit. So to answer your question, contractually speaking, is the buyer entitled to their money? Yes, they're entitled to their money, but escrow won't release it to them. So the matter becomes moot. So here's the issue. The issue is they're going to have to go through interpleader. And by the way, as I mentioned before, interpleader pays itself first. So if this is a matter of like $1,000 earnest money or $10,000 earnest money, there's not enough in deposit for interpleader to even begin. So everyone loses. Now it just sits there in the ether. Sadly, that particular one that I'm referring to happened, if I'm guessing 12 years ago, maybe 13 years ago, still the earnest money is still in escrow. That's on me. I mean, literally, that's my own file. I didn't do anything wrong, but that's my file, and no one could agree on it. So contractually, they're entitled to a return on their money, but escrow holds it indefinitely. That's the issue.
I've had some escrow companies that say when a certain amount of time has passed, they're just gonna release it. Was that ever the case, or is that?
Well, I've not seen that myself. I'm trying to think of a case that it could happen is if that's on the escrow company. The escrow company, if they release funds, they potentially are held liable. So could you have, or could someone have heard of or worked with an escrow company that made that decision to release the earnest money? The answer is yes, but they now take on the liability and also possibly practicing law without a license, because now they're interpreting the contract, right? In order for them to have made a decision on who to release it to, they would have had to read our contract, interpret our contract, which means they're practicing law without a license.
Thank you. Good answer.
It becomes tricky. So that's why we got to tread lightly on how we do our earnest money. So we talked briefly about J3, which is the final walkthrough. You cannot terminate on J3. I recommend our Keller Williams Honolulu side is our minimum is 5 days. The reason why we have 5 days on ours is to account for holidays and weekends, because in theory, if you know you're not canceling on J1, on J3, what actually happens, you start negotiating, right? You negotiate either a remedy, a repair, a credit, or you negotiate the withholding. So if you know that, that should be 5 days, because I've seen people put like 2 days in there and it's not enough time. It's literally not enough time. If it falls on a weekend, escrow's not even open to generate a withholding. It causes you a lot of problems. You're better off putting something 4 or 5 days. Our minimum is 5 for KW Honolulu, so that it allows you time to operate. It allows you time to negotiate.
Okay, question though, what if they don't agree to do anything and like say they haven't cleaned or they haven't done something and they're like, well, tough luck?
Yep. So the question is, what happens if, let's say, cleaning is done and the buyer's not satisfied with it? What happens if buyer exercises their right of J4, which is a withholding, but the seller doesn't agree? What do you guys think happens? Buyer says, I want to withhold $1,000, whatever the 150% is. I want to withhold $1,000, but the seller says, I don't agree with that. I had it clean. What happens? Don't, without you answering, because I know you just did it. What happens? Nothing. It's the same exact scenario as we were dealing with before with interpleader. So the contract has a mechanism for remedy. And here's the good news. The good news is in most cases, that mechanism is used and agreed upon. In the rare cases it isn't, nothing happens.
So you can't close.
No, you can close. Especially, as I mentioned before, assuming all the documents are signed, because that's typically already been the case. Assuming the SAT waiver has already been signed and escrow has it. This is the case. Crystal just had one. They represented the seller. Buyer came in, said it's not, the cleaning is not satisfactory. They did 150% withholding. The seller said, absolutely not. I disagree. And at that point, it was too late. And also because I think they had 1 day in their J3 or something like that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so in that case, they had too short amount of days in J3, which is exactly the point why you don't want to do that. Now,
What if they had enough days?
yeah, then it's still moot. It's still moot because nothing will happen. That then becomes a potential civil issue between the principals after close. No, they can close. So if all the documents are signed, so let me give you 2 scenarios. They signed all the documents as they should, right? They're just not happy with the cleaning. They request the withholding, the seller disagrees. What happens? You close. What happens is it's still going to close. It's still gonna close, but without the withholding, because both parties didn't agree to it. Now, I'm gonna give you another extreme. The buyer does a final walkthrough, wants a withholding, seller disagrees, and as a result of them disagreeing, they don't sign the documents, the final documents. What happens in that scenario? It doesn't close, but the buyer just breached. The buyer is in breach. So now potentially, because of the contract, the way it's worded, is the seller has potentially the right to sue for damages to the buyer. So the buyer might be kind of planting their flag in, hey, I need this remedy or whatever the case is. And now it becomes a bigger can of worms.
So the withholding is an addendum.
Yeah, but it's twofold. It's something that we would do, but also escrow would initiate the documentation for that, for what that withholding amount is. And again, it's up to 150% of the estimated cost to repair remedy. Both parties have to sign.
So basically, J1 and J3 are there for people that are willing to cooperate, but if they're not, it's kind of.
Well, the entire, just so you know, I feel like I'm bumming the entire group out today. I am, everyone's nodding. I'm so sorry. But here's the long and short of it is, who polices a legal document? In other words, because everyone's saying, well, I can't make it. Everything is based on cooperation. And that's true, because we're professionals, right? Everything is based on cooperation. Who polices this document? In other words, if one party doesn't act and perform, can I call the police and say, arrest this man or woman because they didn't perform? Who polices a contract?
Call
A
your
court.
friends.
No, it's the court. The court polices. So in order to get to court, right, we have to sue someone, which costs a lot of money. Less than 1% of lawsuits actually make it in court. Most are dismissed or settled. It sometimes, if you are disputing $20,000, it might cost you $50,000 to win the 20, which is why these things end up falling apart. So not to get you guys all bummed out, but unfortunately, the successful contract, so those who have been doing this for a long time and successfully have closed the vast majority of your contracts, which I know all of you have, you've done so because you were acting as a professional and you were opposite of a professional, and both licensees cooperated and so on and so forth. When they don't, problems occur. But the court polices that. But so does HBR, so does our affiliated boards and HAR and so forth. So J3, a buyer does not have the right to cancel as a result of dissatisfaction during the final walkthrough. We kind of mentioned that. Continuing on to J, talks about home warranties, existing warranties, removal from items. J9, they've added the credit in there, cleaning credit. I always, by the way, recommend, if you guys can go with the cleaning credit, because the number one issue that comes up during J3 is satisfaction with cleaning. So you can remove that from both buy side and list side by just going with the credit. So something to consider. It's nuanced depending on your client's needs, but consider that. Pet treatment. Also, chronologically, J3, J8, and J9 should be in chronological order. I've seen it where it's like 3 days, 3 days, 3 days. And my question would be, how do you have the removal of items in 3 days, cleaned in 3 days, and also have a final walkthrough in 3 days? It's not possible. So what it should do is, if we know our minimum is 5 days for J3, right? You should remove items from property in 7 days, have it cleaned in 6 days, and then have a final walkthrough in 5 days. Makes much more sense.
Can I recap that previous issue and see if my brain's in the right place and if it helps
Yes.
everyone?
Yep.
So J3 and J4, like you said, they're only going to be helpful if you're working with somebody with integrity, professionalism, but they're also only a problem with immaterial facts, smaller things like cleaning. If it's a material fact, you go to section I and you can cancel.
Yeah, absolutely. So material fact, absolutely, or I should say, material fact that triggers a redisclosure. But there be, and let me for the record state, a material fact is not like this light switch doesn't work. That's a fact, but is it a material fact? Material fact is defined in the seller disclosure. It's something that affects the value of the property or someone's.
Yeah. Chad, we lost you on the audio.
So sorry. Is that better?
Yeah, much better.
I feel like Adele. I'm just gonna hold it here. So material facts
You're more
versus
of a
fact.
you're more of a Janet Jackson, but we'll let it go.
Sounds like Keone. So material fact versus regular fact, right? So the light switch not working fact is a light switch not working cause a financial compensation or someone's desire not to purchase that property? Likely not, right? Here's a good way to consider both. If you have two properties that are identical in every way, color, year built, upgrades, and the whole thing, they're listed at the same price. If you're trying to determine if something falls under the bucket of material fact or not, is just consider if that were the case with one property and not the other one. Again, they're in the same neighborhood, they're right next to each other. Would you pay less for this property as a result of that thing? Or would somebody be dissuaded not to purchase it as a result of that thing? That's a better way to kind of indicate whether that's a material fact or not. So just so you know, J1 is a determination of what the property's condition is. That's where a timeline begins. J3 is there to ensure that nothing has changed since J1. So if something has changed, that to Ted's point is a redisclosure issue. That's I2. If something is added on that wasn't there during J1 and is discovered in J3, that's not a withholding issue. That potentially, I mean, it could be a withholding issue, but that potentially is a redisclosure. So would the buyer then have the opportunity to terminate? Absolutely. If it's a material fact, they can get out of that.
That's how you can change it if they need to get out of it because they've done something wrong, is only if you find something.
Yeah, the reason why I'm wording it the way I'm wording it though is you have to make sure, because some people go, oh yeah, we can get you out based upon your final walkthrough. You cannot. The remedy to J3 is J4. But if it's a redisclosure issue, it has nothing to do with that. It's everything to do with I2 or potentially I3B specifically. So just know like where in the contract you're able to exit or not. Right? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
K1, K2, please know the difference. K1 is staking, K2 is staking and survey, which is important. In our market here, it's common if there's a survey that's being done to accept an existing survey. Have you guys heard of that before? Have you guys done that before? Here's a wrong way to do it in section Q. If you just said buyer to accept existing survey. Buyer to accept existing survey. Well, what's on the survey? That's the issue, right? What's on the survey? And also, how old is that survey? If the survey is 10 years old, what you're also potentially accepting is the gap of whatever happened in the 10 years. So if you were a creditor, for instance, here's another way to, well, hold on. Here's another way to look at it. If you were a creditor extending credit to someone, would you want to run a brand new credit report? Or would they, if they said, hey, I got my credit report from 10 years ago, can you look at that? Right? The difference would be is like, well, what happened to your credit in 10 years? I don't know if you're late on something. It's the same thing. So we're talking about encroachments and easements and all that other kind of stuff. Things could have changed within that time frame. So could you accept an existing survey? Absolutely. But you should have language acceptable to do so. And so we have it built into our zip forms. Just to, for instance, it would say something like, upon accepted purchase contract, seller shall provide existing survey within 2 days. Buyer shall have 15 days to review and accept or terminate using section whatever, 01, 02, 03. That would be a better way to accept an existing survey and make sure, obviously, if you do, that you review it. Because there is some inherent risks involved in doing that. L1, L2, pretty self-explanatory. Termite inspections. M1, delivery of documents, pretty self-explanatory. One thing, by the way, to mention on the M1 section is don't delete it. If you guys notice in the front of M1, if you can see here on the contract, it doesn't have a bracket in which you can put NA. The authors of this document had no intention, just like J1, for you to NA that section. So it's not intended to eliminate. Then we get into M2, delivery. All self-explanatory for sake of time. I'm going to kind of fly through here.
Hey, wait, one quick question back on
Yeah.
what was the one you were just talking about before you went forward? Now I got distracted.
M1?
I think so. Oh, no, the one before that.
Let's see.
I don't, I'll have to look back. I'm sorry.
As L2, termite?
Yes, termite. Okay, that's the question. I've always asked for the buyer to choose, but recently I've realized that lots of times sellers have an existing thing in hand. What's your recommendation on M1?
Did you say, did you, you're L2, right? But did you say that you would let the seller has an existing report? Is that what you said?
No, not an existing report, but sometimes they have a company that takes care of it. So,
Oh,
well, question, do you usually ask for the buyer to make the decision of the termite?
yes. For me personally, 100% of the time I have my buyer choose. And the reason I have them choose is it potentially is a conflict of interest if the seller is paying for, let's just pretend that they have a maintenance agreement with ABC termite, whatever that is. It's potential conflict because the seller can easily go, there's no termites, right? There's
Good
no,
point.
I've been paying you for 3 years. There's no termites, right? We're good. I would rather have fresh eyes looking at it, especially in Hawaii where termites are so damaging. The other thing to keep in mind too is, and that's not your question, but it made me think of it, is I've had situations where someone has a previous termite report, maybe a year old. There's so much damage that could have occurred within a year with regards specific to termites. So you'd ought to have a fresh termite report under if at all possible.
Absolutely.
Another thing too, just reminds me of is make sure that you read other brokerages addenda. Other brokerages addenda could be potentially harmful to our own contract. One of which that I see often is that should the subject property be found to have, live and active termites, that the seller is not subject to pay anything over like $500 for its repair or only spot treatment or whatever it is. That's all fine and dandy, but make sure that you read the contract and you're educating the buyers to know that that's the risk that they take with this particular offer, or amend it out or counter it out. Right. So make sure that you take a look at other brokerages addenda. They do that all the time to try to alter some of the contingencies and rights. I'm going to close with this, just section 010203. The rest of it is pretty self-explanatory besides Q. But again, we're talking about this. This is the only way that you can terminate. And I've asked this question before. You guys know how many contingencies a buyer has? How many contingencies does a buyer have to cancel? Geez, Nepali. Nepali just said some outrageous number. Crystal says, Nepali said 347. He said 34. Crystal said 14. What do you guys think? How many ways can a buyer terminate a contract? Just kind of built in without you adding or altering anything that's already there.
7.
16. 1-6. How many ways can a seller terminate? Nepali now said 728. That correct is correct. That is 7. A buyer has 16 ways that they can terminate, and a seller has 7 ways to terminate. And how do I know that? Is if you look at all the paragraphs in the entire contract, it's going to reference either 01, 02, or 03. If it doesn't reference that, you cannot terminate. Could you add termination provisions? You can, right? Because we talked about it. Like if I wanted to say in C2, with rates and terms acceptable to buyer, could you cancel on that? No. But if I said, or O2 shall apply, suddenly that's now an exit. So I just created a contingency if I added that, right? Or sometimes we add in section Q, whatever the case is, or O1 shall apply, O2 shall apply, O3 shall apply. So if you do that on a clause and add that, think of section O as an exit, right? That's like, I'm pointing to the exit. If there's no exit there, I can't get out of the building. O1, O2, O3 are the exits. All right, folks, I'm going to stop there. Do you guys have any questions that I can? Yes, Crystal. Yes. Can you get the slides? Yes. Can you get the KW standard or KW addendum to the buyer rep? Yes. What other questions do you have? Anything on chat? Oh, okay.
W addendum that you have.
Yes, we'll send that out as well. Run it past Keone. He's my
Thank
Michael Jackson and my Janet Jackson.
He's pretty amazing.
He's all right. He's got great hair.
I don't know. We love both of you, so thank you both.
So diplomatic. You love the Jackson too.
I'm
the other
sorry,
three.
you guys are both awesome. I'm grateful to have you, so I'm not just saying it.
Our pleasure.
Thank you very much. Happy holidays.
You're very welcome. Happy holidays. All right, guys. I think that's it. If there's anyone else, just shoot me an email, text, call me. Heroes available.
Mahalo, Chad.
Hello.
Bye.